We now have the pleasure of being joined by Brent Axe of Syracuse.com. Brent, thanks so much for taking the time with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys.
It's an interesting part of the Syracuse season right now. You know, they struggled. They're at 9-11, and we had that whole debrief with your colleague Mike Waters a couple of weeks ago, where we went into panic mode, and then a 4-game win streak happens, and you're feeling a bit optimistic. But Saturday's game against Virginia Tech kind of took the wind out of Syracuse's sails. So we really wanted to look into, like, how did we get here? Because it feels like Syracuse is they're just the only word I could think of is just mediocre right now. It's so many ups and downs throughout this whole 2022, where they haven't been able to string a bunch of wins in a row together and get that signature moment.
Yeah, Ethan, I've been calling them the fighting 500s this year. That just seems to be what they are. And just when you think you're ready to write them off, it's that, the Lloyd Christmas meme, you're telling me there's a chance. And, if they went to 9-12 in that moment you brought up, like, game over, you're not crawling out of that hole, because this team just doesn't play defense well enough. They've been better as of late, but you can't just shoot your way out of that. But then, they start crawling out of that hole, and then they get above 500, and now they're streaking. They won 4 in a row, to the point where I'm calling Joe Lunardi, having Joe Lunardi on my show, just like, Joe, I know this is not likely, but show me a path. I'm expecting Joe to just, like, poo-poo that. And he's like, no, there's a path, but it started with that Virginia Tech game, right? And then, of course, Jessie Edwards gets hurt. And it's like, I think we're finally seeing the balloon deflating. For a while, it was kind of going back and forth, but now the air is coming out and they can't stop it. And what do you do to salvage the season now with 6 games to go, starting with this Boston College game on Saturday? They're really playing for a winning record at this point. They're really playing to not be the first team to have a losing record in Jim Boeheim's tenure, which is incredible when you think about it.
So you think at this point, with the VT loss, the tournament is pretty much done, other than obviously an ACC tournament run? An at-large bid is pretty much out of the question?
I mean, if we could mute old takes exposed from this conversation, yeah, they're done. I mean, they're not a tournament team unless they win the ACC tournament. The beauty of what we've seen the past few years, Ben, is this quad system. Like, you can map it out. You can look at exactly where you stand, how many quad 1 wins you have, where you're at in the net rankings. Like, before, we were just kind of counting on whatever the committee was going to do. And I guess you're still doing that to an extent. They just don't have the resume. If they had beaten Virginia Tech, got a quad 1 win, and now they've got some more opportunities to do that coming up here, I think that'd be a different case. But I just don't see it unless they win the ACC tournament at this point. I mean, to ask them to beat Boston College and Georgia Tech, which they can do, also beat Notre Dame and, let's say, a combination of Duke and Miami, that's a lot for this team without Jessie. I really think they can win one of those games without Jessie. And, Syracuse always tends to prove us wrong just when we think they're dead and buried. It's like a, Michael Myers or a horror movie guy pops up just when you think he's dead. But I just don't see it without Jessie. If they had Jessie, they had a real fighting chance. But I think that that kind of it was that old game we used to play when we were kids. You guys ever play Battleship when you were a kid? That sunk my battleship. Yeah, I think that sunk their battleship.
So speaking of Jessie, a question that's really been intriguing me the past couple of days that I've been thinking about is the improvement he made from year 2 to year 3. You often see guys improve from year 1 to year 2. Buddy comes to mind when you think of that, the improvements from his freshman year to his sophomore year. So in your time, watching and covering Syracuse basketball, what are the biggest improvements you've seen comparable to Jessie's leap this season?
In terms of players, I mean, Ronnie Cycli comes to mind immediately. Guys, when Ronnie Cycli came here, he was a mess. I mean, he just couldn't play. And by the time he was done, he was a star. He was an anchor on teams that were making, Final Fours and deep runs in the tournament. Obviously, he had a long career in the NBA, and now he's one of the great DJs in the world. So, the multifaceted player there. Arenze Onuaku comes to mind, to the point where, speaking of losing players, when AL went down, that was a championship team. I thought that team could have won all the way. Him going down prevented that team from going as far as they could go. But a couple of years before that, you were hearing the typical Jim Boeheim snarks about being out of position on defense and some of the things he was saying about Jessie last year. Rakeem Christmas comes to mind, to the point where, unfortunately, his senior year, obviously they took themselves out of the tournament, but I've never seen like a player just carried an entire team the way he did that year. And big men, it takes a little bit longer, right? And there's going to be more names that flood into my head here as we go here. But Jessie's is one of the most accelerated I've seen, because you got to remember, a lot of those other players who run. Now, Ronnie was a project too from overseas. He came in from Greece. But a lot of these guys are in the system. They're basketball players. They play AAU and come through. Jessie didn't even start playing basketball, till he's like 15, 16 years old. And, Jim Boeheim just takes these chances on these long players that can come in. And if they can mold them at a proper rate, they take up space in the zone and become great players. But man, Jessie, the confidence he had around the rim. I know the foul trouble was always an issue, but he was even cutting back on that. And it just, the difference is you can see, and you can apply this to a lot of sports, but we'll apply it to this. You could see the difference with a player when they're thinking and when they're playing. And Jessie was playing. Like, he wasn't like, where am I supposed to be here in the zone? And like, that takes you a half a second slow. He was just playing. He knew where to be. He knew it was in a rhythm. And I'll tell you what, guys, to add to that, Joe Girard was a huge part of that. Girard found a connection with Jessie, and I think that's why Joe's been playing so well as of late. So it's going to be interesting to see the adjustment he makes with Frank in there. But you need somebody that can put the ball in position for you to be your best. And Joe and Jessie finally found that connection.
Some of the guys you mentioned that had improvements like Jessie, like Cycli, ended up with long pro careers. And this might be crazy, but whether it's this year or next year, what do you think about the idea of Jesse Edwards, not being done with North American basketball after his time at Syracuse is done?
Right now, I think Jessie could be a pro. I don't know if he could play in the NBA. And it's something that Jim Boeheim says all the time. He's just got to get bigger. And some of those guys, like Rick Dolezaj last year, right, that he could eat all the pizza in the world. He just didn't gain the girth and the weight and the muscle that he needed. He got bigger and certainly handled it as well as he could. But I feel like he's got to get bigger. I've got an NBA scout. He's a character on my show. I call him the scout who knows, because he's always right about these Syracuse guys and where they project. And that's what he tells me all the time. He's like, he's just got to get bigger. But he's got the length. He's got the ability around the rim. He'll have to learn how to play man-to-man defense at the next level, which is always an issue with Syracuse players, of course. But, man, the trajectory he was on, I mean, he's the most improved player in the ACC. Even without the games, he won't play. Now put him at the trajectory next year and let him ascend playing next year in the ACC. He could be first team all ACC. So he's got every opportunity to get there. I just don't think he's there yet.
So comparing Jessie to Benny is something I also find interesting, because Benny, obviously a much higher rated recruit than Jessie was. Jessie didn't play much his freshman year and really didn't even play much last year until the end of the season when he finally started getting minutes. Benny, it's been really up and down, but do you think he could take a leap as well from his freshman to his sophomore year? Granted, he doesn't test out the transfer portal, as that's something a lot of people have talked about all season.
Now, to Benny's credit, he said he's not going to do that. And what I like about Benny is he gets it. He understands the process. So, like, he didn't wake up one day and say, I am hereby a 5-star. Like, somebody else gave him that title, right? He loves working with the coaches. He busts his ass in practice. He gets the process and he understands it. So I think he'll be back. But in order for him to make that projection, he needs an offensive breakthrough in these last 6 games, guys, because we've seen defensive moments from him. I think he's a great shot blocker. He's obviously one of the most athletic players on the team, but there's something not translating on the offensive end right now. Not that he gets a ton of opportunities there. He missed a dunk in Syracuse's last game. So it was like, that could have been the moment. I think he needs that, because I think even as a freshman that only gets in limited opportunities, you need that memory bank. Right? You need something that you can work on through the summer into the fall, and you can relate to, like, I did that in a game, not a practice. I did that in a game, and you can come back to that feeling. So hopefully he gets the opportunity. One would think he will, given Jesse's out and everybody kind of moves up the ladder a rung, to have that offensive breakthrough. But the potential's there. And I think that's why Syracuse fans were so eager to see him, because, Jim Boeheim hates this, and he just said this the other day on his radio show. Like, I don't play players because of potential. He needs to see it in practice, and he needs to feel good about putting these guys in. But it's hard not to see the potential when he's out there, right? He's right there. And you want him to have that breakthrough. And I think with 6 games left, potentially more in the postseason, depending how far they go. I think he'll get there.
If he doesn't have this postseason breakout, what are the odds that with, 5 recruits coming in next year, some of them pretty highly rated, he could get a little bit lost in the shuffle here?
Well, it's funny because it was our friend Cam Ezier. I was watching a New House at Night the other night, and he made a great point. And he said, you can't treat 5 freshmen like Benny Williams, right? At least with Benny, he's like the only young guy in a mix of a lot of veterans. So you can kind of put him in the doghouse and you can kind of treat him like a freshman. Can't do that with all these recruits coming in, right? But at least Benny will have the benefit of being around, going through the process, having that trust with the coaches, whatever development he makes over the summer. But look, there's more competition there. Like, I'm going to be fascinated by this. And I think Jim will be back and will coach this team. And man, all those, and he said it himself. It was funny how it was like 3 weeks ago, guys, Jim Boeheim on his radio show. And sometimes these things just come up randomly, callers ask questions, but he's talking openly about next year playing 4 or 5 freshmen. And I'm like, are you sure that's Jim Boeheim that we're talking to right there? Like, where are we? But that's just the world we're in. And that's the roster transition and the portal and everything we're in college basketball. So Benny's got a little bit of a leg up, guys, but not a big one, right? And you got Justin Taylor coming in. You got Chris Bunch coming in. All those recruits that are going to push him. And I don't think there's that much separation at this point. We'll see what happens with an offseason of development.
The most intriguing thing about that to me is not only did he say that, but he said 2 to 3 freshmen might start as well. Yeah. And I mean, that's unheard of from Jim Boeheim, not to mention the decisions he talked about on his radio show a couple of weeks ago as well about, maybe Jimmy's going to seek a waiver for a 5th season. That could potentially be another roadblock for Benny. Swider and Buddy both have another year of eligibility as well. And while there have been hints to say, oh, this is their final season, they're seniors, they're going to move on, there is definitely still a chance that they may be back and block. And then how are you going to play those 3 seniors, 5 freshmen, Benny, your 2 centers, and then you still got Joe and Symir as well? It might be too many players.
In a way, I want to see that happen just to see how Jim talks his way out of that one. Like the way he'll be snarky with the press and we'll be asking questions about that and how it just always seems that no matter what, it's like a snow globe. You shake the Syracuse snow globe and it always comes to 8 players, no matter what the roster is, how many freshmen, seniors, 5 stars, no stars, everything just falls into place and it's 8 players. Whereas next year, if all those players are back that you mentioned, not to mention, of course, the portal is a factor now and who they add in and out of that. I want to see it happen just because it'll be interesting to cover and to see how they do that. And maybe Jim in his 47th year would be like, you know what, maybe I got to play 10 guys. And that will be a hell of a story. We'll never see man-to-man defense. I mean, that's, that the world is ending in that moment. If that happens, like everybody get in your bunkers because it's over if that's the case. But could we see Jim have to go further down the bench if we got a team like that? He might be talked into it finally. It took him 47 years, but it's patience is a virtue.
We're speaking with Brent Axe, ESPN Syracuse and Syracuse.com. And let's move it back to this season for a second. A couple games left to go. What do you think is the eventual result for the Orange here? Is it, March Madness, NIT, neither? How are they doing in ACC? Just kind of what do you think transpires over the last couple of weeks?
So I went through it on my show the other day, guys, on a kind of a Russo Mad Dog style. Okay, Mikey, that's a win. That's a win. That's a loss. That's a win. I don't know. I think that could be a loss. And it came out 16-15. So barely above 500, avoiding, at least at that point, a losing season, because obviously the postseason to come. But I think they'll finish 16-15. I think they'll win a game in the ACC tournament and then lose the next game. And then it's a matter of, I think the NIT would want Syracuse. It's just a matter of does Syracuse want the NIT? And I think they would play it just to get the experience of it. And that's always the question with the NIT is, do you want to be there? Are you motivated to play in it? Think about the stretch they're going to go through, guys. Playing 5 games in 10 days, whatever the ACC tournament brings. They're going to be exhausted by that point. Do we want to do this NIT thing? I think they eventually will. But it may be a game or 2 in the NIT. That's kind of where I see it going at this point. And that's all by the hair on their chinny chin, by the way. You have to be 500 to get into, correct me if I'm wrong, to be in the NIT.
They actually repealed that rule.
Oh, they did.
So you don't have to be, but then again, if you're not, you don't have a great shot of getting into the NIT
Correct.
anyway.
Right. And would they want to go at that point? Right. So it's just like we said a few minutes ago, when that Jessie Edwards injury happened, it felt like there's 6 games to go and anything could happen, but it felt like, okay, like that's the last straw here. Whereas if he was there, this would be a hell of a run to watch, to see how they finish, which one of these games they could pull off. Would they get back in the conversation? We're used to, being nervous around here for the 2 weeks leading up to Selection Sunday, and are they in, are they out? So it's going to be a different type of thing. Instead of that, it's, should they even bother going to the NIT, right? Because, what do you get out of that?
All right, Brent, one final question for you. You mentioned before how you think Jim Boeheim will be back next season, but do you think this season, 2022, this is rock bottom for a Jim Boeheim team in this, this era of Syracuse basketball in the ACC? Is this the worst it could be? Do you think next year, if he's still the coach, will be better than this season? Obviously, you're not going to be able to predict the roster with, who's going to leave, who's going to stay, but do you think this season will be the bottom of the valley?
There's no question about it, because say you want about Syracuse, as we said a moment ago, kind of riding that bubble line the past 5 or 6 years. You're not riding the 500 line. It just doesn't happen around here. Statistically, it's rock bottom. I mean, how many times was I reading Mike Waters? You guys said Waters, right? If I've heard of this guy, you're reading Mike Waters' program, game previews, and you'd see a line and they're like, this is the worst record Jim Boeheim's had at this point since, like, that happened 7 times this year. So there's no question it's rock bottom by record, by being completely out of the tournament picture at this point, add in some injuries, add in, for a while there, this team didn't win more than 2 games in a row until that 4-game winning streak. So there's no question about that. And it's, Ethan, it's all what you said. What's the roster? I've seen Jim Boeheim pull a lot of miracles out of his hat with some teams that, you didn't think could make a tournament run, and did. So it all depends on what that roster is next year. But I think he should get that opportunity to redeem himself, to show the program's on track, to show that this was an anomaly, right? This was just one of those years that rarely happens around here. And next year we're going to get things going back on track. And look, recruiting rankings are what they are for a number of reasons. You're rewarded for the number of players you have, right? But there's talent on this team coming in next year. I think Justin Taylor could be a pop and play Buddy Boeheim type of player. Bunch is been really impressive. And if it feels like there's always a freshman or two that exceeds expectations, but it all depends on who comes back. Like, what's the mix? Is Swider back? Where's Jessie at? Apparently his injury, he'll be fine with next year. And running that offense through a big man is so big. What's Gerard's step forward next year as a point guard, right? He surprised me, guys, because I think we're getting to the point where the choice with Joe is he's got to either run the offense or be the offense. And I felt like he was making the wrong choice there for a while, but I feel like he's balanced that out. So can he continue to do that next year? There's a lot of things that I got to see to really answer that question, but to put a label on this one as rock bottom, I mean, we've already established that. That's not an opinion. That's a fact.
All right. Brent Axe of ESPN Syracuse and Syracuse.com. Once again, thank you so much for joining us. I mean, what else could you say about this team? There's a lot that's gone on, and it's been one of the most interesting years in the history of the program. I don't think you can deny that.
No, you can. As we said earlier, guys, I don't root for the team, but I do root for interesting. And there's no question this team has been interesting. It's just been unfortunately on the side of the spectrum that, determining whether a team's going to finish with a winning record or not. That's interesting, but it's not fun. How about that?
Definitely not fun. Brent, thank you once again very much for joining us.
My pleasure, guys. Thanks for having me.